And so finally then, to finish up with Kant, we have this last section of the book, which is actually part 2. And as you can see, it's barely a quarter of the book by comparison with the rest of the book, called the Transcendental Doctrine of Method, whereas all the rest of the book up to this point had been the doctrine of the elements. And basically he's made all the book's points by this point. This last part has the feel of odds and ends. It has the feel of an appendix. It's not really essential. He's just thrown on some things that he didn't mention. In some cases, he actually just remakes points that he's already made, just to be thorough. It's that German thoroughness that has come to be characteristic of German philosophy. So with the Transcendental Doctrine of Method, what he does then is he goes through 4 topics. The first one is the discipline of pure reason, where he says that each one of these has to do with pure reason. There's a discipline of pure reason, there's a canon of pure reason, there's an architectonic of pure reason, and there's also a history of pure reason. And then all 4 of these topics need to be taken into account for building this new science of transcendental criticism. And the first of these, the discipline of pure reason, basically what he does is he contrasts the approach of the mathematician with the philosopher, and he says that one of the problems with philosophy up to this point has been, and this is especially clear in Spinoza's Ethics, where he literally draws the whole thing out in imitation of Euclid's Elements, is that the philosopher has tried to imitate the kinds of methods of certainty that the mathematician has used to derive his geometrical proofs, and to apply those kinds of methods to the working out of problems such as proving the existence of God, for instance, or the ultimate nature of the world, the existence of the soul, and so forth. And Kant says that's a no-no. That's not. Philosophy is very different from mathematics. And one of the main differences is that whereas in philosophy concepts are simply given, and the philosopher can define the concepts, but he doesn't really create the concepts. They're given to him, I suppose, by tradition. Deleuze would dispute that. Deleuze says in What is Philosophy that the essential business of the philosopher is the creation of concepts. But Kant doesn't put it that way. Whereas the mathematician's primary business is to construct concepts. And of course, he's got geometry in mind here, the way concepts are constructed step by step in geometry. And so the mathematician would normally then begin his text with definitions and axioms and then proceed to prove them. Philosophy should not work that way. It should arrive at its definitions at the end, as in a way Kant sort of does here with this doctrine of method, which is a sort of collection of definitions, at the end, and work out the arguments before that. And so there's a complete disconnect between the methods of the two, and up to this point they've been confused, and Kant, as part of his separation, of course, of science from metaphysics, also now wants to separate the methods of the philosopher from that of the mathematician and keep them separate. That's the point of much of this discussion, which is the discipline of pure reason. There's a couple other minor points, none of them really stood out in my mind. But then in the canon of pure reason, which is the section that follows this, which is followed by the architectonic and then the history. In the canon of pure reason, he is interested in, he says, pure reason has a canon, and by canon he means that it has a sum total of principles by way of which it proceeds. That's its canon. Pure reason has a canon, but speculative reason, pure reason is of course broken down into speculative reason and practical reason, and speculative reason does not have a canon because the entirety of the Transcendental Dialectic, as we have seen, was based on showing that speculative reason cannot arrive at anything real as far as knowledge goes of the ultimate architecture of the universe. It can't pretend to either prove or disprove the existence of God or the soul or freedom or immortality or anything like that. So it can't have a canon. The canon applies only to practical reason, but practical reason has only to do with morality and ethics. Practical reason is the realm of pleasure and displeasure of ethics. It has to do with how things ought to be, whereas science, natural science, has to do with how things are in terms of their laws. Practical reason has to do with human conduct in society and how things ought to be in an ideal sense. And it therefore does have a canon, a system of principles. And it's very important for practical reason. It's not so important for pure reason that God, freedom, and immortality exist, but it has important implications for practical reason. Whether one believes one is acting out of freedom and one has free will or not makes a big difference insofar as how one behaves in a society. And so these principles that are believed in have a regulative function, not only a metaphoric function, but they have an effect on human behavior. And they're good for society, I think Kant is saying here. They're good, they help keep the society functioning. And of course today we see what happens when such ideas disappear from a society. The whole thing falls apart because there's no kind of transcendental guidance that shapes human behavior, so there are no consequences, so everybody does as they please. And as a result, you get what we have, serial killers and the like, spree shootings and so forth. That's what you get in a society in which the metaphysics have been stripped bare and there are no consequences for one's actions. You get this nihilism, and such actions as the spree killing that we saw in Colorado over the summer are the direct result of an attempt to fill the semiotic vacancy of this nihilism with violence that will generate meaning of some sort. If the meaning isn't there, then it tends to generate acts of atrocious violence to try to found systems of meaning and create meaning. That's what the human psyche will do spontaneously when confronted with an ethical or semiotic void. It resorts to violence. But anyhow, so this is how his discussion of the canon of pure reason winds up, and he says that, and then he's of course drawing the rough draft sketch here for what will be the critique of practical reason, in which our actions will be guided by the maxim that in whatever the situation happens to be, I should behave in such a way that I would will that my behavior become emblematic or paradigmatic, by means of which all people should behave in that action in the way that I behave. So it should be exemplary in that sense. He doesn't mention that in this. He does start talking about maxims, but that will become the guiding maxim, this so-called famous categorical imperative of the critique of practical reason. And then he goes into the architectonic, the theme of the architectonic, which is, of course, simply the system building. And it's what he's done all along here. He's built a huge system that Schopenhauer accuses him of taking architectonics too far, in which we have the transcendental aesthetic with intuitions coming to us as sense impressions. And then we have the concepts of the understanding, which confer synthetic unity upon those intuitions and build science. Then we have the ideas of the reason, which confer synthetic unity upon the manifold of the concepts of the understanding to try to give them a totality, a cosmic metaphysical totality, but in doing so transgresses the boundaries of science and also of knowledge, and creates a metaphysical world picture that cannot be held up any longer in Kant's day now as a model of knowledge, but simply as a model of belief, of regulative principles that are no longer constitutive, but only to be regarded as metaphoric and as having a controlling and determining effect on human behavior. And so that is the architectonic of the book as it moves from the senses to the understanding to the reason and the various conflicts between the understanding and the reason, the mess that the human Western Faustian intellect gets itself into in its entanglement when science becomes entangled with metaphysics. And then he just finishes up with a couple of pages about the history of metaphysics, in which he says that there are three important points with regard to the history of metaphysics, which is, in respect of the object of all our knowledge, the extremes have been either Epicurus on the one hand or Plato. And with regard to Epicurus, it's the idea that the senses are the primary source of knowledge and the intellect takes a backseat. With Plato, it's the other way around. He devalues the senses and upholds the ideas. Same thing with the second criterion, where he says in respect of the origin of the modes of our knowledge, we either have the empirical mode that goes back to Aristotle and which is carried on by Locke and Hume, or we have the innate idea mode, which originated with Plato and is carried on, of course, by Leibniz and Descartes, and to which Kant has written this entire book as his attempt to resolve the antinomy. And then finally, in respect of method, we have either the naturalistic method or the scientific method. The naturalist, he doesn't give any examples, but he says that the naturalists eschews the use of technological instruments such as telescopes in his study of the cosmos. I'm not sure what he's talking about here. But with regard to the scientific method, there's either the dogmatic or the skeptical approach. The dogmatic approach, he says, is characteristic of Wolff, and by that I presume he also means people like Leibniz, and the skeptical method as exemplified best by David Hume. And his method, the critical method, flies in between those two extremes and attempts to resolve the whole thing by founding a new kind of transcendental science or transcendental critique. And that is the critique of pure reason in video format, in its completed form. And Kant, as I say, in writing this book, tied up in a neat little bow all the major problems of Western philosophy that began with Descartes and simultaneously inaugurates a new epoch, namely the epoch of German Romantic idealist philosophy, which then follows after him.